All right, thank you everyone for joining. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes to start. Thank you. Okay, so we'll get going. Hello, everyone. My name is Dan Brooks. I am Club Z's National Activism Officer. Welcome to Club Z's Eye on Zion webinar. Today's webinar is Fighting the NGO War on Israel. Before we introduce our distinguished guest, I wanted to say that this webinar series would not be possible without the support of our generous donors. If you would like to experience more of this type of programming, please consider supporting us at clubz.org. Now on to today's topic. The war on Hamas has unleashed a storm of new libels against Israel. Meanwhile, in Judea and Samaria, longstanding libels persist. Quote unquote, settler violence, land grabs, Israeli home demolitions, and Israel supposedly killing children are daily headlines. Not only are these accusations false, but they're an inversion of reality. And worse, a European Union funded and orchestrated NGO war against Israel aids and abets these Palestinian crimes. Now, this huge story has received practically zero media coverage outside of Israel, except for Jewish press. The most prominent force pushing back is not the Israeli government, but the Israeli NGO Regavim, which is on the ground documenting, reporting, and legally fighting against this daily war on Jewish rights. Joining us to go deep into this issue is Naomi Linder Kahn. Naomi received degrees in Poli-Sci and Near Eastern Languages and Literatures from NYU. She served as director of the Schools of Judaic Studies and of Education at Lander Institute of Jerusalem, and she is a well-known editor and translator. Mrs. Kahn is the director of the International Division at Regavim, a research-based think tank and lobbying group dedicated to protection and preservation of Israel's sovereignty. Together with her husband, Ari, she raised her 5 kids in Givat Zeev, where the family has lived for over 30 years. Before I hand it off to Naomi, I'd like to urge all of you, if you do have questions, to post the questions in the Q&A box on Zoom, and I'll communicate them to Naomi during our Q&A time. With that said, Naomi, I have to say we here at Club Z would like to offer you a truly special thank you for your time joining us, especially because you're in Israel, where it's 11 p.m. now. So again, thank you for that. And I hand it off to you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to join Club Z. This is not the first time that I have been with Club Z, and I'm glad to see that since the first time, which was years ago, things have really taken off and the organization has developed and grown and is a real force. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to tackle essentially a huge range of topics tonight without getting bogged down in any one of them in particular, just to try to give an overview and to frame it in terms of lessons that should be learned from October 7th and the weeks and months that have passed ever since. Before we go any further, I just got a push notice on my phone as we were getting started, released for publication. 3 IDF soldiers were killed this evening by a Hamas rocket at the Kerem Shalom crossing, which is where we are providing massive humanitarian aid theoretically to the civilians of Gaza, but in general, really what it is straight to the hands of Hamas. That's a topic for another day, but I just wanted to note that the war is ongoing. The losses, unfortunately, are ongoing. And we have a responsibility to learn from the war itself, from what started the war, from the things that led up to it, in order to prevent this the tremendous loss of life that we are experiencing now, the tremendous destruction on both sides of the border, and to learn lessons for the future to ensure and to preserve Israel's safety, security, and sovereignty. So we're going to dive right in. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to look at a series of slides. Some of them I'm going to have to run through very, very quickly in order for this not to turn into a 6-hour lecture. I promise I will try to be brief. But again, if there's anything you want more details about or more information, add questions to the chat option. And also keep in mind, I'm going to put a slide up at the very, very end of my presentation where you can find all of the resources, all of the materials I'm going to share with you this evening for further study. Always look to Regavim's website if you need a resource for current information, accurate data, legal presentations, court precedents, etc. We have full reports, we have ongoing updates of news on cases. So our website is a great resource. But now we're going to share the screen and we're going to look at some slides together. So here we go. I hope you are seeing my screen now. Yes, Dan, give me a thumbs up. Cool, great. Okay, so here we go. I've actually labeled this talk Rights and Wrongs in Judea and Samaria. And we're going to try to look at blood libels. Very appropriate because today is in Israel Yom HaShoah. Today is Holocaust Remembrance Day. And it's a gut punch, honestly, to read the news in Israel, current news, on a day like this. But the old blood libels are still with us. They've taken on, in some cases, a new form. And there are some new blood libels that have been formulated, and we're going to look at a few of those this evening together. So, if I can get this to move, there we are. Before we dive in, I want to just give some background, first of all, on Regavim, the organization that I work for, actually, and then sort of a legal framework to understand what makes things legal or illegal in Judea and Samaria. We're going to focus on Judea and Samaria tonight. And the third, to try to give you an understanding of what the reality is on the ground, not what the headlines say, but what's actually out there. So, Regavim's mission, as I think Dan encapsulated in the blurb about this lecture, is Regavim was formed 17 years ago based on the understanding that the question of land use policy is the most basic expression of a country's sovereignty, meaning the land itself is your most basic resource. Without it, you don't have a country. And the decisions about how the land is used, for what purposes, by whom, and what that will mean in terms of the country's future, that is really the most basic expression, the most basic decisions that a sovereign government has to make. And we began to understand from all sorts of different issues happening in Israel at the time, we began to understand that Zionism was falling out of the equation of Israel's land use policy. Our public policy began to, the Zionist vision was eroded. We began to ask why that is, but more importantly, what the ramifications of that shift are for the future, and what we can do about it. So Regavim, as Dan mentioned, is a field-based think tank, which sounds contradictory, but we divide the country up into regions. We have field coordinators who go out into the field every day and see what's actually happening. What's happening on the land, who's using it, for what purposes? Is it legal? Is it illegal? Is it positive? Is it negative? What are the ramifications for the future? So that leads us, that field work then leads us to, we collect all this real-time information, we bring it all back to the office, we map it out using a GIS system, a geographic information system, satellite-based, so we can see exactly where things are. And then we do something really remarkable that no one else does, and that is that we take a step back and we connect the dots, and we look at what picture emerges, and we begin to see patterns, we begin to see policy or black holes of policy, we begin to see where policy is needed, where legislation is needed, and then we approach the government at every level, going from the very bottom all the way up to the top, to try to get the government to respond, to react, to take responsibility, and to express Zionist goals and Zionist principles in public policy having to do with land use. Sometimes that involves not just filing official complaints, but actually suing the government of Israel, which we do every single day. We sue the government and its various branches in order to force them to contend with reality that is more convenient for them to ignore, or to contend with failures in legislation and policy or enforcement that they are overlooking, purposefully overlooking. And we'll talk about why that is as well. So what is the current reality on the ground? We're going to discuss just the tip of the iceberg on a few of the areas that have to do with Judea and Samaria. See, what you see on your screen now are the covers of a few of our recent reports. But again, we've been doing this for over 17 years, 18 years now. And so we are, aside from our work everywhere else in the country, in the Negev, in the Galilee, in Jerusalem, where we are considered the foremost experts, generally more expert than the government of Israel itself, on issues having to do with land use and what's actually happening on the ground. So we're going to take a closer look in particular at this, I don't know if you see my pointer here, but this report that we released after the outbreak of the October 7th war, the Palestinian Authority's conquest of the security buffer zone. This is important because it essentially is a nutshell presentation of things that we've been saying for 17 years, predicting the events of October 7th, essentially, on a small scale, on a larger scale, and on a grand scale. And unfortunately, many of our worst predictions were realized on October 7th, and they all stem from what we have identified as the failure of the Israeli government to enforce the law. And everything that we do contends with the law, works within the law, and respects the law. And when the law is insufficient, we work to amend the law. So we have done that, for example, very, very successfully in passing amendments to Israel's Planning and Construction Code, which revolutionized the ability of the government to enforce the law against illegal construction. In the first year after the amendments that we helped to write and to legislate were in force, illegal construction nationwide was slashed by over 70%, 70. The year after that, even more. So we've been able to, with years of work and very, very specific methods, to identify exactly where legislation and policy changes are needed in order to protect Israel's land resources. Unfortunately, that major accomplishment has no effect in Judea and Samaria, and we're going to talk about that as a background. The law that is in effect in Judea and Samaria, and this is getting a little bit technical, but you need to reconnect with your Israeli history. When Israel was first recognized as a sovereign state by the League of Nations, by the United Nations, in the very famous roll call there, where people said yes, no, they recognized an independent, modern, sovereign state of Israel within certain borders. Think hard, what were those borders? Those borders included everything to the west of the Jordan River. And that means that they included Judea and Samaria. But the very next day, actually the same day that Israel was recognized as a sovereign state within those borders, 5 Arab armies attacked and invaded Israel. And the Jordanians, at a certain point, managed to tear away from Israel's sovereign territory certain portions to the west of the Jordan, and they created a new name for them. They called them the West Bank in order to justify their presence to the west of the Jordan, which was an international border. And they occupied and eventually annexed those territories. That occupation and annexation was never recognized by the countries of the world. So in 1967, when Israel restored to itself those territories, once again in an act of self-defense, the natural thing, the thing that every other country in the world would have done, would have been to reassert its full sovereignty in that area. But Israel instead left everything in abeyance and said, let's negotiate a resolution, a political resolution for the people living there. So in the interim, Israel said, we will maintain the system of law of the previous recognized sovereign. So that system of law is still in force in Judea and Samaria today, because as you know, there has not been a negotiated political resolution with the Arab countries in general, or with the Arabs living in this territory. So who was the previous recognized sovereign in Judea and Samaria? Not the Jordanians, because they were an illegal occupier. Not the British, because they were a temporary caretaker. Actually, the Turkish Ottoman Empire was the previously recognized, internationally recognized sovereign over this territory. So to this day, the state of Israel continues to apply, to enforce, and to uphold Ottoman law in Judea and Samaria. That is a very bizarre thing. This system of law is completely outdated and is not in effect anywhere else in the world, even in Turkey. And the Ottomans themselves, before the Ottoman Empire was dissolved, actually rejected this system of law because it was so outdated. But we're stuck with it in the meantime. And that enables, for various reasons, that enables all sorts of land grabs, which the Palestinian Authority has used to tremendous advantage, and is literally taking over land by using loopholes in this outmoded system of Ottoman land law. We're going to just jump right in here. I'm going the wrong way. I apologize. This is the first lesson that I want all of us to try to learn, and we're trying to get the government of Israel to learn from the events of October 7th and its continued reliance on a very strange attitude towards law enforcement, upholding even this strange, outmoded system of Ottoman land law in Judea and Samaria. The first thing that has to be done is that we have to connect the dots. We have to redraw the paradigm and begin to understand that illegal construction in strategically crucial areas is not, by the Palestinian Authority, is not random, it's not coincidental. It is a well-planned, structured, systematic annexation of territory that threatens the existence of the entire state of Israel. This is what we mean when we say connect the dots. Right after the outbreak of the war, we mapped out the buffer zone that is supposed to protect all of the state of Israel from a repeat performance of October 7th, but 10 times larger. Israel's border with Judea and Samaria, what's known as the Green Line, is 10 times longer than the border that it shares with the Gaza Strip. So imagine the exact same events taking place at a magnitude of 10. It's not a very pretty picture. And this is what we've been trying to warn the government about for 17 years. What you see on the map here are illegal structures built by the Palestinian Authority in the area that was supposed to give Israel a buffer zone from areas placed under Palestinian Authority control, so that Israel would be able to respond and protect itself in the case that there would be an incursion like there was on October 7th from Gaza. What you see here is that there are 19,000 illegal Arab structures specifically inside that buffer zone that was supposed to be a sterile zone that would give Israel reaction time. When you connect the dots, you see that this is not random. This is not coincidental. This is not somebody needed a place to live and therefore built themselves a house. The Palestinian Authority has systematically taken over the buffer zone in an attempt to create a situation where at any point that they choose, they can attack. And as you know, Israel has very, very little strategic territorial depth. Look at these areas here. This is the whole depth of the state of Israel. It's tiny. It's 15 miles wide. That's nothing for an army, right? And you have a massive army being built by the Palestinian Authority, trained by the United States of America, by the way, funded by the US and a consortium of European countries. And this is what we have on our doorstep, to the point where in some places, you can stick your hand out of your living room window and reach your hand across this supposed border, and there'll be houses on your back fence and your backyard of people who are sitting and waiting for the order to attack. It sounds far-fetched, but so did the invasion from Gaza until October the 6th. The second lesson that we are trying to bring home, which the Israeli government knows full well, but most Israelis try to ignore, and that is a lesson that we have hammered home and presented to members of Knesset since the outbreak of the war, is that the Palestinian Authority and Hamas are partners. Palestinian Authority fighters participated in the atrocities of October 7th. The Palestinian Authority officially endorsed the activities that were, the atrocities that were carried out on October 7th, and is now paying to the terrorists and their families who participated in the atrocities of October 7th, and is turning them into national heroes, naming streets after them, naming public projects after them, etc. There is no difference between the two. We actually have on our YouTube channel many, many, many clips, public statements, interviews by the heads of the Palestinian Authority, from the prime minister all the way down, not only applauding, extolling the atrocities of October the 7th, but also of explaining very, very clearly and saying exactly what they mean, that the Hamas is part and parcel of the Palestinian political framework and always will be. So for anyone who's trying to bury their head in the sand, we created quite a lot of, we produced quite a lot of material explaining exactly what it is that the Palestinian Authority says and what they mean. We let them speak for themselves. This report, which you can see on our website, tracks dozens, literally dozens, of Palestinian Authority security force officers, members of their secret service, of their police, of their army, who again are trained and funded by the US and the European Union, who are actively involved in acts of terrorism. They have killed dozens and dozens of Israelis, and they are applauded, they are celebrated, they are given full honors, and the ones who survive are given lifetime salaries. Terrorists who are released in hostage swaps have become high-ranking officers in the same Palestinian Authority police force, and they turn their guns against us on a regular basis. So that is the second lesson that we are trying to impress upon our leadership, that they can no longer ignore this and pretend that it's not there, that the Palestinian Authority and Hamas are one and the same. The third lesson that we have to learn, that we're trying to get people to learn, is that we're way behind. Anti-Zionist forces have been working on these blood libels and laying the groundwork for the things that you're seeing today. They've been working on them for a decade or more. If you go onto the website of B'Tselem, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more depth in a moment, but if you go on to B'Tselem's website, you will see that the slogan for this entire campaign that has now resulted in US and European sanctions against Israeli individuals, companies, nonprofit organizations, and they are now attempting to actually sanction high-ranking officers or politicians from the Israeli government and the IDF, and to sanction whole units of the IDF during a time of war. All of this was laid out and given a name by B'Tselem over a decade ago. And the slogan is, settler violence equals state violence. So let's have a look at that, and let's talk about this new old blood libel. The sources of the funding and the sources of this narrative of settler violence have a very, very clear path. It didn't just happen all by itself. And we're going to look very briefly at who created this narrative, who is paying for this narrative, and I think you all know by now what the ramifications of this narrative are. But it starts off with misinformation, creative reporting, essentially anti-Israel forces that cook the books. And we also have real data with which I hope every one of you and everyone you know will push back against that misinformation. And lastly, we're going to try to consider the opportunities that we have now because of this, because of the war, opportunities that we have to actually push back against the anti-Israel narratives that have been current for so long. So, sources of the funding. Settler violence as a campaign first began to appear in European Union reports in 2012. As I say, we're way behind. They started planning all of this over a decade ago. In 2015, EU reports first began to dedicate separate chapters to the whole question of settler violence. And ever since then, anytime something happens in the news stream, whether it be the kidnapping of the 3 teenage boys or Operation Protective Shield, Guardian of the Walls, anytime there was an issue with anything that you can think of that popped up in the news stream, the European Union, look back on their website and you'll see that they say this has caused a surge in settler violence. Was it ever true? No. The data shows the exact opposite. Is it true now? Absolutely not. The data, as we will see in 1 minute, shows exactly the opposite. But keep in mind that this game has been going on since at least 2015. In 2019, the European Union began to actually pay separate earmarked funds for a campaign regarding settler violence to a few well-known anti-Israel nonprofits, quote unquote, in Israel. And I'm going to show you some data that will probably knock you off your chair. The two main culprits here are very, very famous. One is B'Tselem, the other is called Breaking the Silence. In Hebrew, they're called Shovrim Shtika. And those two organizations were given very specific earmarked funds to create a campaign regarding settler violence. That means either to present material or to fabricate material when necessary. Here's what it looks like. B'Tselem, look at those numbers. $13 million from foreign governmental sources alone. And that's not including the New Israel Fund, George Soros, the Rockefellers, the Ford Foundation, all of these non-government sources. They have a massive budget and they know exactly what they're using it for. Breaking the Silence is no different. In 2019, the year they first received their funding for the settler violence campaign, they had a budget of 29 million shekel. That's $10 million in today's money. It was more than 60% of it from foreign governments, right? So when you call these things nonprofit organizations or civil society organizations, that's a lie. They aren't. They are actually foreign government agents. And that's how they get their money, for creating the narrative that the European Union is interested in them creating. So another thing that you should notice is when they call themselves a nonprofit, I get a good laugh as well, because in 2019, they had an income of $10 million, but they only spent $2.383 million. That means that there's a good $7.5 million floating around unaccounted for. There's no transparency here. We have no idea where that money goes, but believe me, we can guess. And when we see the next few slides, you can figure out for yourselves where some of that money is going. Now, I'm going to go back for a second. What I mentioned here is that these two organizations, B'Tselem and Breaking the Silence, were the ones who got, in 2019, were the front men for this settler violence campaign. But they were far from the only ones. And actually, the really big money was much quieter and much better hidden. I took this off of the European Union's website. I simply did a very, very simple search and said, funding for projects having to, in the occupied Palestinian territories, that's what they call it, having to do with violence. And you can see that in that 1 year, in 2019, they spent $30 million and gave it to various organizations, all of them operating here. And some of them paid backwards, like this organization, for example, FIDH, FIDH, I'm going the wrong way, boom, boom. FIDH, this one here, which defends human rights fighters, quote unquote, they pay Breaking the Silence as well, and they pay B'Tselem as well. And all of the same people are on the same boards of trustees of all of these organizations. Yesh Din, Rabbis for Human Rights, Physicians for Human Rights, all of these anti-Israel organizations that are operating here. There's tens of millions of dollars floating around, and it all ends up in the same hands and the same pockets. And it all goes to the same thing, and that is to create a narrative. So how do they do it? First of all, they feed all of their information to a quote unquote objective international body. And that is UNOCA. We call that UNOCA. That is the United Nations Office for Coordination of Human Rights, Humanitarian Aid. Sorry. Okay. So their budget for 2019 in the occupied Palestinian territories was another $30 million. And they receive their information. They claim that they have objective employees out on the ground. Those employees, the ones whose names we could locate, are also all employees of those same foreign government NGOs, meaning B'Tselem's board of directors also are paid employees of this organization, and so on and so on. So we have a massive flow of tens of millions of dollars a year, and this is only 2019. Those budgets have gone up every single year since, and this is what they go for. So the United Nations, this OCHA dashboard is the United States government's main source of information. But again, this is fed from B'Tselem and Breaking the Silence. You have the Palestinian Authority that produces its own materials, and you have the B'Tselem reports, which also are given tremendous credence by the US government. So what do they say? This is what the United Nations dashboard says. I'm going to take you in a second to that dashboard, but I want to point out this very important bit of information here. The UN dashboard itself says, incidents involving Israeli settlers includes attacks and alleged attacks by Israeli settlers, as well as incidents involving and clashes following the entry of Israeli settlers into Palestinian communities. Very nice. It also includes, and here it comes, Palestinians killed or injured during attacks or alleged attacks they perpetrated against Israeli settlers. That means that if an Arab comes into your community wielding an axe or a gun and tries to murder people and someone shoots him, that is considered by the United Nations settler violence. In addition to terrorists killed in action, attackers killed by Israelis who are acting in self-defense, and injuries sustained in traffic accidents, including in which Israelis were involved, those are also considered settler violence. Also, every single time a non-Muslim goes up to the Temple Mount, that includes Jews and non-Jews alike, anyone who is not a Muslim, who goes up to the Temple Mount during visiting hours accompanied by police, that is considered an act of settler violence because they are considered storming the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So you have thousands and thousands of reports of settler violence during Jewish holidays when Jews are permitted to go up to the Temple Mount to visit the holiest place in the world. And that is all considered by the United Nations and now by the American government as settler violence. All of this goes into the statistics. If you don't believe me, here's the website itself. And this is what it looks like. Data on casualties right here. This is their dashboard. And if you know how to use these filters, you will see that if you just limit the time and the place, perpetrators here dealing with only Israeli, you see that they count in here also Israeli forces. That means if a terrorist is killed when the IDF goes into to arrest someone and they resist and there's a gunfight, they count that as settler violence as well. But if you limit it only to Israeli civilian settlers and you limit the time since the war, you will see that they have a grand total here since the outbreak of the war of, this is actually an additional month, we can play with that, March. We can even look, here we go, October 7th, 12 Palestinian fatalities, right? That includes people killed in traffic accidents. That includes people who were killed while attempting to murder Israelis. As far as the Israel police, the Israel Secret Service, and the Israel Ministry of Defense and the IDF know, there have not been any reported Palestinian fatalities caused by an incident of violence initiated by a Jew. Zero. All of these were acts of self-defense. And in every single case, the person who actually took out the attempted murderer or successful murderer, the Arab who was perpetrating the attack, every single time there was an arrest, there was a trial, and they were found not guilty by reason of self-defense. Let's get back to our slides, sorry. So I just wanted to show you how you can look and understand this material without my help. It is possible for any of you to go onto the UN site and understand exactly what you're looking at. So now let's do this again. Right. So B'Tselem is the other source, one of the main sources for all of this material. Again, their settler violence equals state violence. I want you all to take a second and think about what that means. They created this slogan back in 2012. And what they have been trying to do is not only to defame, to libel, and to undermine the legitimacy of Jewish settlement in Judea and Samaria, they have tried from the very beginning to use this as a means of undermining the legitimacy of the IDF and of the state of Israel as a whole. And that's why they call it settler violence equals state violence. And that has really come full circle now as they are beginning to trying to sanction the prime minister, members of the government, the chief of staff, and whole units of the Israeli army. Notice that the majority of materials on the B'Tselem website, and I can take you there as well. If we had time, I would do that. But the majority of the materials provided by them are all provided by paid employees of anti-Israel organizations. The sites of these purported incidents of violence are all overwhelmingly illegal Palestinian Authority outposts, the ones that I showed you in those red dots on the map. They also conflate IDF and home front security actions with settler violence. And almost in every single report, without fail, you will see phrases like settlers and soldiers, settlers accompanied by soldiers, settlers dressed as soldiers. The whole point of this campaign is not just to attack Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, but the entire moral underpinnings of the IDF and of the State of Israel. There is virtually no documentation of any of these acts of purported settler violence, which is very strange when you think about it, because these people know how to use cameras.
So Naomi,
This is, yes.
So is it fair to say that the leadership, if not the rank and file of both B'Tselem and Breaking the Silence, are just outright anti-Zionist?
They are outright anti-Zionists who are paid very, very well to be outright anti-Zionists. They fabricate data, and they have been proven to fabricate data. This is one of the examples on the B'Tselem website of a proof of settler violence. Do you see any settler violence there? No. What they claim here is that settlers came and chopped down olive trees. Do you see anything like that in this picture? No. But you only know that that is the case if you bother to go on the website and look for the documentation. This is more documentation of settler violence on B'Tselem's website. Do you see settler violence? No. What we do have is real data. I know that we are short on time, so I'm going to run through it really fast, but I will tell you that there are three main sources for real data: the Israel National Police, which leaked its own internal data to the press, but would not confront the United States with it for some reason. I don't know why. But as you can see, this is the number of Jewish-initiated acts of terrorism in the past year. 0. In October, they counted, this is from November. In October, they counted 3, but I would also point out that what they consider acts of terrorism in the Jewish sector also includes things like graffiti on buildings or taking down Palestinian flags. Things in the Arab sector, of course, count only if there are actual physical victims. But in the Jewish sector, they count everything from threats to graffiti to destruction of Palestinian national symbols as settler violence in the Jewish sector. Strange. Anyway, other places where you can look to get real data is from the Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This is a link to their website, but they stopped reporting at the end of 2023. They only reported on Arab violence against Jews and only incidents in which there were casualties. So just very, very quickly, in January 2023, 7 Israelis were killed by attacks and 10 were injured. In February of 2023, another 7 and 6 more injured. In March of 2023, 1 was killed and 8 were injured. In April of 2023, the last month in which they reported, 4 more people killed and 18 injured. Now, the most verifiable data, the most authentic and reliable data comes from an organization called Rescuers Without Borders. All of the data is verified and it is used as the basis for situation assessments by the Army, the Shabak, and the Israel Police. And this is what it shows for January to June of 2024. I know it's in Hebrew, but the graphic speaks for itself. 2,100 rock attacks, almost 800 Molotov cocktail attacks, 342 burning tire attacks, 286 explosive devices, that includes roadside bombs and other types of bombs, 101 shooting attacks, and 185 laser blindings of drivers on the roads. This is what it looked like from October 7th to December 7th. Not good. So here's a summary. There were 3,681 violent incidents perpetrated by Arabs against Jews in Judea and Samaria and the Jordan Valley in the first half of 2023 alone. That's a monthly average of 510 incidents that resulted in casualties. And we're not talking about graffiti or threats or anything else, actual physical attacks. But between October 7th and December 7th, there were the average went up from 510 average a month to 690 a month. This is the unreported violence. This is the real surge in violence. And this is the surge of violence that is victimizing the Jews of Judea and Samaria, not perpetrated by them. The blood libel has completely reversed the picture and completely distorted the reality on the ground. The lessons, I'm hoping that some of the things on the screen here are familiar to you, but the lesson, the message that I want to leave you with is that we have a responsibility to win two wars right now. One is the war against Hamas, the physical war that is, it's torture. It's torture for all of us. I have 4 sons and a son-in-law. All of them are combat soldiers in reserves. It's not a picnic. People are dying, and we have no choice. This is a war for survival. But we also have the responsibility to win another war, and that is the battle for truth. So Hamas just recently revised its fatalities figure and admitted that it had cooked the books once again and slashed the number of fatalities by 1/3. Instead of saying now 33,000 people, it's now reduced it to 21,000 people. That's quite a leap. They suddenly, 11,000 people came back to life or something, very exciting. But it's clear that Hamas has absolutely no commitment to honest reporting, to truth, and they will play with the numbers anytime and any way that they can. Keep in mind that even with those doctored numbers, the civilian to combatant ratio in Israel's war against Hamas is the lowest in recorded military history. When America was fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq, the civilian to combatant ratio was approximately 3 civilians for every 1 combatant killed. Israel's ratio is 0.8 civilians for every 1 combatant killed. That is unprecedented in world military history. Israel goes to extraordinary lengths to prevent civilian casualties. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And just by looking at things that come up in your newsfeed, you will be able to show how easy it is for them to lie and for those lies to be accepted. The Al-Ahli hospital, where they first claimed that Israel killed 500 innocent people, and it turned out that it was a Hamas rocket that killed about 15. The Shifa Hospital, their humanitarian center, which is a massive Hamas compound where hostages are held and were killed, massive tunnels, and the nerve center for the Hamas terrorists. UNRWA, clearly a part of the problem, not part of the solution. And all of these things are simply proof that there's a war for truth going on here, and we have a responsibility to win it. So how do we do this? I'm going to leave you with these 3 screens here. You can scan any of these right now with your phone and follow us either on TikTok, on Instagram, on our Telegram channel for updates. And I encourage you, if you ever need resources on any of these topics or other topics in which we're active, go to our website. Every single report is there in full access, divided by issues, divided by dates, divided by areas, all sorts of things and updates. It's all there. So I encourage you to use those resources and follow us if you want to get real information, truth. And now I'm going to try to take some questions if you haven't all completely dried up and dropped from all of this yet.
No, we've actually had an increase in attendees like as we've gone. I think it's just a busy Sunday. Thank you so much for sharing, Naomi. You know, it's no such thing as too much information, but especially this, like you were saying, there's like you were suggesting there's a big information blackout. And I always have Israel supporters coming up to me asking me like, where can I find this information? And I think that we're struggling with that. And now we have we've been introduced and reintroduced to Regavim, and it's such an important resource because you know, this info is flying at us constantly in live form, and it's important to debunk it in real time. And so I think you've really helped us you know, get to that point where we have the information at our fingertips. So thank you. So let me get to the questions. First question, somebody's asking about that unit in the IDF that was recently sanctioned and then unsanctioned by the US government. Can you tell us just a little bit about that? Like who gave those reports and how did it get to that point?
So it's a great question. And it is indicative of really of this campaign. I think that it's part of the bigger question of how did the American government, how did President Biden essentially come to the point where he issued this executive order to sanction individuals and then this whole unit of the IDF. This is unprecedented, and I encourage all of you to ask a very, very simple question. Where'd they get the information upon which this executive order was based? On what was it based that these 4, 6, 8 individuals had to be sanctioned, and this particular unit of the IDF? They were never sanctioned. The United States government essentially backpedaled on it. President backpedaled on it before it went ahead because it became apparent how ridiculous the whole thing was. But the answer to all of those questions is the same answer. B'Tselem and Breaking the Silence targeted specific people who are who they felt were key influencers in Judea and Samaria, and targeted them for sanctions. So we asked the United States government, we asked the president, we asked the press secretary, we asked anyone that we could ask, what are the sources of information upon which these sanctions were based? And the answer was, we're not telling. Now, that's a very strange thing for the American government to say. And that spoke to us volumes about where this information is coming from. It's clearly not coming from reliable sources. Otherwise, the American government wouldn't be embarrassed to say where they're getting their information from. So what you saw this evening, I'm going to unshare my screen, sorry. What you saw this evening was essentially the same sources, the same fabricated information that is being fed to the United States government from a variety of sources, but it all comes from the same people. And those people have targeted and have attempted to undermine very, very key members. I can tell you what I know about the individuals who were sanctioned. So one of them actually owns a construction company, and much of his business is helping to develop Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria. But B'Tselem and Breaking the Silence don't like that. So they decided to libel him and to say that he was involved in acts of violence against Palestinians. Proof? No.
Right.
Think about the statement that it makes also. The United States government has decided that it will circumvent or completely disregard the fact that these people have never been charged with a crime. They've never been convicted of a crime. They've never even been accused of a crime. They've never had any run-in with the authorities in Israel. So on what basis were these people chosen? Now, the Netzach Yehuda unit, which was the specific unit that was mentioned for sanctions, but was eventually not sanctioned, is made up of religious soldiers. And it was created as a means of enabling religious soldiers to serve in the army without having to come into contact with things that they felt would be problematic for their religious observance. So these separate units were created where there were no women, there's no shared showers and whatever, no bases that have these kind of mixtures to enable people who come from a more
Traditional.
I don't even know what to call it. Yeah, it's a very different ideological background, but enable them to serve in the army. B'Tselem and Breaking the Silence don't like that either. These are very ideologically committed soldiers. So they targeted them. This unit is also extremely active, happens to be active in Gaza at the moment too, which is why the United States government, I think, finally realized you can't really sanction one part of one unit of the army. Right. The army is one organic whole, and they sanctioning your main ally, democratic
especially bad optics
army during a war is a very bad idea. So that fell aside for now.
I have another B'Tselem question. Can the government, considering these are Israeli orgs, can the government do anything to shut them down under democratic pretenses or democratic, foundations?
Well, the government certainly can. The government has been very, very hesitant to act against them for a very long time. They've been given carte blanche actually to give lectures on IDF bases. They've been allowed to come into schools and present their point of view. Israel is really actually a democracy. And so we allow people to say all sorts of things. But what this government has finally done, and that we've been encouraging them to do for a long time, is they've begun to look at the people who are involved in violent confrontations in Judea and Samaria, and those who are not Israeli citizens, who have come to Israel under tourist visas, under false pretenses, and then and actually are actively provoking confrontations with the IDF or attacking Jewish communities. Those people are now finally being deported. Their visas are being revoked. So it's been a long time coming. It has been clear for many years that the confrontations, the violent flare-ups that happen in Judea and Samaria are fueled by, supported by, and populated by outside agitators who are paid members of these anti-Israel groups. They come over from Europe and from the United States for the specific purpose of making the IDF look bad, causing confrontation, and publishing extremely anti-Israel materials, simply fabricating them or staging them. And they've gotten away with it for a very long time. And Israel now, for the first time, is moving against them.
Right. I have a couple more questions, and for the interest of time, I'm going to try to stammer out a possible answer. Maybe you can agree, disagree, offer a third way. Okay. And this is a loaded question. So one is, you know, with all that you're sharing in terms of the truth, and it seems to be fairly accessible truth, and it can be proven. You know, why is this not being acted upon by media? And so I guess, you know, how can this be done? I guess the answer to the first question I would say is it's a narrative war, and for the media that don't, you know, this doesn't fit their narrative, they're just not interested in it. Do you think there's also an aspect that it's just simply not, it's not easily found, or that's just simply, it's really just doesn't sell? It's not going to sell.
Well, I think it's not easily found, but that's not by accident. I can't tell you how hard it is for me to get facts to the media. It's very difficult. It's very difficult. Most of the time, there is a media bias. If it doesn't fit the narrative, they don't want to hear it.
Right.
A lot of them also, I would say, take the easy way out. So if you have an organization like B'Tselem or Breaking the Silence that has a $30 or $40 million budget every year, they produce materials, they bring over journalists and politicians, they traipse around all sorts of places with them and introduce them to paid employees who will tell them whatever it is they've been told to say. Right. And that's what they print. It's much easier than actually digging down and getting to the bottom of the real truth. Another problem is that the government of Israel has been far too silent and has not spoken out because they don't want the pushback from the United States. They don't want the pushback from the Europeans. It doesn't look good when Israel has to go up against the United Nations or the European Union. They're big, they're powerful, they're our trade partners. These are macro issues, and there are a lot of pressures that are brought to bear on this. So, for example, the Israel police all along had data about how much actual violence there is on the part of Jews in Judea and Samaria, but they didn't release it. And we had to practically sue them to get information. And they said, this is classified information and we will not release it, and but eventually it was leaked. Wow. Now, why did they not do that? Because they did not want to go head to head with the Biden administration. Certainly not now. So,
so politics
sometimes
is huge.
The truth takes a beating.
Yeah.
But the more people know about it, the more people share the information, the more people shout this information and share materials that are factual, the more chance we have that the Israeli government will be empowered to actually speak up for itself. And our friends in America and Europe will be empowered to speak up as well.
Next question, why would Hamas now revise these numbers considering they lie all the time? Did they really sense that their numbers would have been fact-checked and debunked at a certain point?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
That's really, it's to save face for the
Absolutely, absolutely.
Next question. How pervasive is it that that so many doctors in Gaza and all the press are members of Hamas? It's more than the mainstream public, of course, is led to believe, I assume. Or is there different shades of that? Those who are sympathizers, those who are under pressure or threat?
Everyone is a sympathizer, everyone is under pressure, and everyone is under threat, and there's no possible way of dividing those things up other than impartial internal polls. So the Palestinian Authority and other Arab professional pollers have conducted polls both in the Gaza Strip and in Judea and Samaria regarding support for Hamas. And the numbers are shocking and very, very depressing. The numbers of Palestinians living in Judea and Samaria who support Hamas, applaud the atrocities of October the 7th, and call for a repeat performance is over 85%. These are our purported peace partners, right? These are the people that we're supposed to be making peace with. In the Gaza Strip, actually, and not surprisingly, the number is slightly lower, not slightly lower, significantly lower, simply because they're living with the outcomes right now of Hamas's policy. But still, over 70% of the people living in Gaza, when asked not by us and not by name and anything else, but reliable internal Arab polls show that over 70% still, with all the hardship, with all of whatever else is going on there, with the loss of life and destruction, over 70% support Hamas and call for continued attacks against Israel.
Right. All right, two more questions. Why has the government not dealt with at least the buffer zone problem, considering that seems to be a very pressing issue, and tunnels are being built in the West Bank as we speak?
Correct.
Sort of two-part question.
Why is the government not dealing with the buffer zone problem? I'll tell you, if you look on our website, and we're about to publish another study. We do it every 8 months or so. This time it was pushed off a little bit, but we look at illegal construction throughout Judea and Samaria, not just the buffer zone, the whole thing. And the whole thing now is 95,000, I will repeat, 95,000 illegal Arab structures in Area C, the area under full Israeli jurisdiction. And that doesn't include even the massive land grabs that take advantage of agricultural law under the Ottoman land system. So we're losing control. When the Oslo framework was first created and the division of territory of Judea and Samaria between the Israelis and the Palestinians was created, it was created as a 60-40 split, 60% to Israel, 40% to the Palestinian Authority. With all of these shenanigans, all of the illegal construction and the agricultural takeovers, it's now 60-40 the other way. Wow. They've taken over more than 20%, and that is a conservative estimate. Why is the Israeli government doing nothing about it? Who's paying for it? Who's building it? You are. American tax money, European tax money, the European Union. If and when, the very rare occasions where Israel actually pulls down one of these illegal structures because it's an egregious security threat or a safety threat, you get the West Bank Protection Consortium, that's Belgium and France and Holland and the UK and all that. They sue the state of Israel for compensation for
under international law.
Can
Israel cite international law based on the...
Israel does, and Israel says, we're not paying you compensation. This is an illegal structure, and it is violating our sovereignty and the law, and it's creating a security threat, and you have absolutely no right. But to prevent them from doing it to begin with would be to open a full-scale pushback against the European Union, all the European governments, and in a lot of places against the United States government. Israel doesn't have what it takes right now to do that on its own and deal with everything else that's going on. And this has been going on for years.
I've read
years.
Sorry, I've read that there might be some elements in the Israeli government who are okay with looking the other way and passively letting the PA assume this sort of like embryonic state structure because they figure, you know what, that's just inevitability, and they're sort of resigned to that. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say, and that is certainly, it wouldn't have happened if that were not the case. The problem is, now that we've learned what we've learned, now that we've seen what we've seen, now that we have seen what the real intentions of the Palestinian Authority are, even if you wanted to deny it for the past 25 years, since the 7th of October, how can you? They say loudly and clearly, from the river to the sea, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority are exactly the same and say the exact same thing. How can you look the other way if you know what they're building is a base from which to operate against you for your total eradication? You can't turn the other way anymore. Even if there was somebody to make peace with, this is not the way to do it.
Right. Okay, last question. Why is the whole concept of Matzar Minhali in Israel of settlers so veiled and obscure? How does Israel and the IDF view the settlers?
That's a very complicated question.
It's a heavy question.
Very complicated question. It's a real problem. Again, the method through which the top officials who make these decisions and implement Israeli it's military policy, but the people who have been appointed, I'll give you guys homework. I'm not going to spell it out for you here, but I'll give you homework. Google who were the over the past 25 years, who were the chief officers, the head of Central Command. Central Command is the Pikud Merkaz, that is the part of the army that is actually the sovereign in Judea and Samaria because it's still under military rule. How did they get to be appointed to that position, and what did they do immediately after they had that position? So I'll tell you some of the names, and then you'll begin to understand that they weren't appointed by accident. Ehud Barak was one of them. Our Boki Alon was one of them. All look back and you will see that there is a very, very strong specific political identity to the people who are given this job. And essentially they have either by action or omission, by enforcing or failing to enforce, have aided and abetted the creation of the backbone of a Palestinian state in the heart of the land of Israel, without any public support for that, simply by implementing policy or failing to implement policy as they saw fit. And that's why Regavim exists.
All right, we just got one last question in because it's hot off the presses. If people maybe have heard that the U.S. just announced a pause on ammunition shipments to Israel. I don't know, all the particulars, but I don't know if you've had a chance to see that headline.
Nope.
There you go. It's sort of the latest, what I would imagine is a political maneuver to put pressure on Israel to wrap up its campaign to defeat Hamas. And this is probably going to be more of that, I'm sure.
Unfortunately, I can't say it's a surprise. It's not a surprise. We expected this to happen. It's moral bankruptcy of the highest order. It's not the first time that the United States of America has done this to Israel. Right.
And secondarily to the immorality of it, it's also self-destructive and counterproductive. So it's
correct. And unfortunately, Israel has failed to learn the lessons from the 1950s all the way till today. The United States government has kept its hand tightly on the faucet and used that as a pressure, and we have not taken that to heart and created our failsafe for this eventuality, which we should have known was coming sooner rather than later.
Well, it was an amazing presentation. Thank you so much, Naomi. It's a lot to know, and I know our audience is very informed, but there were things that I was not aware of, and I think that Regavim makes it a lot more digestible in the way that it's just laid out. And that's really important because there's a lot to take in. So thank you for joining us and for all the
One
work.
last thing.
Yeah, please.
Sorry, don't want to interrupt, but if you have specific questions or anybody wants more information and wants to contact me directly, if you go onto our website and click contact us, anything written in English comes to me because I'm it. I'm the only English
Really, you're the
person.
English rep?
I am the entire international division right here. So anything that you send, or you can just post my email to anyone who's interested, anybody who wants to reach out. I'm pretty much always available, and I will be in the States giving lectures for the next 2 weekends, back and forth. So, and if you want to lecture in your community, in your school, and your whatever, reach out and we'll try to make it happen.
Are you going to be on the East Coast, West Coast?
I'm going to be on the East Coast this time. I'm going to be in the New York area. And then I'm coming back for Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut because I couldn't see myself not being in Israel for those. And then I'm going back again to New Jersey. So, but we're pretty mobile. So
great. Yeah, we hope to connect with you when you're here.
Great.
So we thank you and the work that Regavim does for Israel and the Jewish people. It's just so vital, and it's really in way too short supply. So you guys really stand out. And lastly, as a reminder, this webinar series would not be possible without the support of our generous donors. If you would like to experience more of this type of programming, please consider supporting us at clubz.org. So once again, Naomi, thank you so much for joining us. And please, everyone, enjoy. Thank you for joining us as well, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Bye-bye.